topic of this lecture is the public and semi-public sectors, and Lou Rockwell just makes these titles up and assigns them to us, and we usually never ask what do you want us to say. So I'm not sure what I'm going to say is what he had in mind, but probably he does base it on knowing what some of the things I've written over the years, and so. In one of my areas that I did some work with a colleague of mine, James Bennett at George Mason, over the years, where we got interested in the nonprofit sector of the U.S. economy. And I guess the first book we wrote was published by the Cato Institute in 1985. It was called Destroying Democracy: How Government Funds Partisan Politics. And we had a huge database of federal grant dollars that went to nonprofit organizations, and we found out that typically the money would go to some organization with the ostensible purpose of feeding the hungry or helping the poor or saving the environment or some noble-sounding cause. But then most of it would be used for politics. It would be used as campaign contributions, lobbying, and so forth. So there was sort of this circle where the government would give a nonprofit group money. They use the money to lobby to get the politicians who gave them the money reelected. They get reelected. They give them more money. They use the money to lobby and help the politician get reelected. He gets reelected again. They give him even more money, and that's how we got into this whole business of studying the nonprofit sector. And another thing we found. Then I didn't realize this because I never really looked into it or studied, but the American welfare state was never administered to any significant degree by the federal government itself. When the American welfare state really got going in the 1960s, of course it started really. Herbert Hoover had some small welfare programs. There were a few state and local welfare programs around the American Civil War time even. But we didn't really put big money into it until the mid-1960s. And what they did was they funded literally thousands of nonprofit groups. So all this money went to the nonprofit groups who would administer the programs. And these are many of the same groups that Jim and I wrote about in this book. And so most people, when they think of nonprofit, they think of the local cancer charity, the local symphony, the Mises Institute. That's true. So it's a very broad area, very broad industry, really, the nonprofit, because there are good nonprofits like the Mises Institute, of course, but there are a lot of scoundrels also. And so I think it's a worthwhile area, in other words, for economists to look at, I think, because this money is highly leveraged. At the time, 1985, Jim and I. So we thought it didn't seem like a lot of money by Washington standards. It seemed like just under $1 billion a year that we found was going for politics, which is all illegal, by the way. We cite in our book many laws and even Supreme Court statements and that say you cannot use money, taxpayer money, for partisan politics. And at the beginning of the book, we quote Thomas Jefferson from his Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty, saying that to compel a man to contribute to a cause with which he disagrees is sinful and tyrannical. And he was referring to using tax dollars to finance a particular religion. But we argue the same goes for a particular political viewpoint, whether taxing anti-abortion people to pay for the political activities of the pro-abortion movement or vice versa. It's sinful and tyrannical under Thomas Jefferson's view, for example. So by way of introduction, I just thought I'd explain to you how I got into this studying the nonprofit sector. And another area also that's maybe more apparent is that a lot of the government-funded nonprofit organizations run various types of money-making commercial businesses, like the American Association of Retired Persons. Has magazines and all sorts of products that it sells, and it's tax exempt, and it gets government money, various types of grants and things, and so it outcompetes private companies that sell the same products. So there's sort of an indirect government-funded crowding out of the private sector that goes on too. But the main thing I want to do this morning is talk about a way of thinking about these sectors, the so-called the government sector, the nonprofit sector, by just having you think a little bit about the incentive systems that exist that are different in the private proprietary sector, and the second sector is the government sector, and the third sector, so-called, is the nonprofit sector. And so the incentive, first of all, private, and I won't spend a lot of time on incentives in the private sector. Many of you, or most of you, maybe all of you, are all familiar with all this. But the distinguishing feature of a private business sector, for example, is the business owners are what some economists call residual claimants. That is, if you own a business, or even if you're the manager of a business, you're not the owner, to some degree you're the residual claimant to profits and losses. That is, when you make money, you claim at least part of it. Managers often are given bonuses based on profitability of their division or the part of their company that they're operating. And so business managers often are directly rewarded in terms of how profitable they are. And of course, if you're the owner of a business, that's certainly true. And they're penalized if you lose money. If you're the business owner, you bear in the loss. And so any kind of cost-cutting or product-improving effort, the owners and to an extent the managers are the residual claimants. And that, of course, provides the right incentive. It provides the incentive to cut costs and improve the product because the carrots and sticks are there. That is, there's a big carrot dangling in front of your nose in the shape of a dollar bill if you cut costs and improve your product. And then there's a stick. You get beaten with a stick, so to speak, of losses, personal financial losses, if you don't do that, if you let your costs get out of control and you don't keep up the quality of your product or service. The stock market plays an important role in all this, in the success of the proprietary sector in a very fundamental way. And Ralph Nader, you all know who Ralph Nader is, don't you? As years go by, Ralph gets older and older, and the students, the current generation of students might not know who all the bad guys are anymore. But he ran for president last time, so he was at a high profile last time. But he's made a whole career out of corporation bashing, of course, and all sorts of crusades that he's waged against this or that corporation, starting with the Corvair automobile. He started his career there. But one of the things he never seems to realize that if the average person out there who owns a share of stock or some shares of stock in a company, and this company is acting improperly, the management are not making as much money as they could be making, they're paying themselves too much, they're giving themselves too many perks, that is big staff, company cars, company airplanes, going to resorts all the time, spending the shareholders' money, really, the owner's money. What option does the stockholder have, who are really the owners? People like Ralph Nader seem to think they have no option other than waging some sort of boycott campaign led by him, or better yet, regulating, getting the government to regulate the behavior of these corporate executives. But if people who own stock, what can you do if you disapprove of how the company that you own stock in is being managed? Sell your stock and put it somewhere else. That's all. You don't need to get Ralph Nader on the telephone or anything to give him money. You don't need to do that. And so if you sell your stock, and if enough people do that, what happens to the price of the stock of Corporation X? It goes down. Stock goes down. That punishes the company. A lot of executives themselves own a lot of that stock, and so they'll feel a direct financial pinch right then and there. But another thing that's probably more important is it puts the takeover market into play, or it can anyway. The corporate takeover market, and basically the corporate takeover market works in this way. There are lots of people out there who earn a living as specialists in finding companies that they think are undervalued. That is, they're not making as much profit as they could be making. And if they're right, what they do is they'll organize, say, a proxy fight. They'll get some investors to buy up enough shares to maybe take over some positions on the board of directors, because those positions are often based on the number of shares that certain people or institutions or investors own. And so once they do that, then they can fire the existing management and put in their own people and run it differently according to their business plan that they think will improve the profitability. And if they're right, if they do improve the profitability, you see they own all these shares of stock. So if they're right and they can improve the profitability, the price of a stock is based primarily on the expected future profitability of a corporation. So if they can increase the expected future stream of income, stock price goes up and they make a lot of money. And that's what's in it for them to do that. And so that's what takeovers are about, basically. And there was an old PBS show that I used to show this to some of my classes. There was I still have it in my files back at home. I didn't bring it here, but it was filmed in the 1980s when there was a big takeover wave in corporate America, and they had 2 tables, and on one side over here they had people like T. Boone Pickens. Anybody ever hear of this guy? Kind of a colorful name, T. Boone Pickens. One guy. He's the only guy with gray hair. I've heard of T. Boone Pickens. But T. Boone, not T-Bone, T. Boone. He was a wealthy guy from Texas, I think. I forget what I think he owned an oil company. And but he was financing a lot of corporate takeovers at the time. He was doing this. He was putting investors together and his money and taking over these companies. They had him and several others like him on this side, and then they had the CEOs, chief executive officers of these other companies that had been taken over or threatened to be taken over by the guys over here. So it was like chickens over here, foxes over there in this television show. And the interesting thing was the moderator asked the CEOs. He asked one of them, "What would you do if Mr. Pickens over here calls you up on the phone and says, 'I'm calling to let you know that your company is in play'?" That is, and what that means is that T-Bone is organizing investors to purchase enough shares to offer his shareholders more money than what they can get right now if they sold today for the shares, so that they can kick him out, fire him, and put a new person in the job. And the man's response was, "Well, I would immediately call a meeting of my board of directors, and we would look over our whole operation, and we would find out where we could cut our costs. We would find out, do we have certain plants that are not making much money, if any money, and do we need to close them down and use those resources into our plants that are making money?" And he had this big long list of efficiency-enhancing actions that he would do. And of course, that what question does that raise? Why wasn't he doing it before? Well, a lot of reasons why he wasn't doing it before, and one might be, like most human beings, he might prefer leisure over labor, and so one of the things the takeover market does is it lights a fire under the butts of corporate executives, and it forces them to not be so sluggish and so negligent over maximizing profits for their shareholders. Because there is a separation of ownership from control, after all. The owners are the stockholders, and the controllers, so to speak, are the day-to-day decision makers, the CEO and top executives. And that's what we call an agency problem in economics. But the takeover market is a way of disciplining this. Now, there are anti-takeover laws that have been enacted in several dozen states that have weakened the takeover market, made it harder to work. And so, and I think a case can be made that a lot of the scandals, like the Enron scandal and WorldCom and all that, may possibly not have happened had it been the takeover market been more vigorous. In fact, Michael Milken, you know who Michael Milken is, as some of you. He graduated from the Wharton School in I think 1975, and he started out working for $25,000 a year for Drexel Burnham, an investment bank. And then he went on commission, and he was so good at his work that by the mid '80s, on his commission, he was making $500 million a year on commission. And one of the things he was doing is finding investors to take over companies like the T. Boone Pickens type, and also he was finding investors to invest in companies that the banks would not lend money to, like CNN, for example. Ted Turner couldn't get a loan to expand CNN outside of Atlanta originally, and it was Michael Milken who put the investors together to fund CNN and MCI also, companies like that. But he also funded a lot of these takeovers, and look what happened to him. He ended up in jail for supposedly violating 5 or 6 minor securities trading violations that no one had ever been prosecuted for before. And they used the criminal mafia RICO laws to get him. They threatened to put his brother in jail and take all his money if he didn't confess to some crime. And so that put a bit of a damper on the takeover market, I would argue. And so the takeover market hasn't been as strong. Finally, it's ultimately there's a survivor principle we talk about in economics with regard to the private sector. Companies that don't strive to minimize costs and maximize profits for the shareholders won't survive in the long run. And it's because the consumer, of course, is the ultimate arbiter of success and failure. And this, I'm using this as an excuse to read one of my favorite quotes from Human Action. Mises is talking about the consumer and the belief on the part of most people that it's really the managers who run the show, business managers who run capitalism. Here's what he says. A superficial observer would believe that they are supreme, that is, the managers. But they are not. They are bound to obey unconditionally the captain's orders. The captain is the consumer. If a businessman does not strictly obey the orders of the public, he suffers losses, he goes bankrupt, and is thus removed from his eminent position at the helm. Others who did better in satisfying the demand of consumers replace him. And then he goes on to badmouth consumers in general and talk about how they are such stern and heartless taskmasters, because if, on a whim they might decide, I don't like this product anymore, and your company goes bankrupt if enough of them decide that. And so it's ultimately the consumer that is at the reins here. So that's what I wanted to say about so the incentives in the private sector. On the government sector, sector number 2, it's very different, of course. And one of the main reasons is there are no profit and loss statements in the government sector. There are budgets. Now, why is that important? Well, for one thing, we said with the private sector, if you cut costs, you have your accounting department can tell you, congratulations, you cut costs, profits are up. Or vice versa. Bad news, you let costs get out of control, profits are down. Your accountants will tell you that. Or if you improve your product and sales are up, that's what accounting is all about. In the government, that doesn't exist. It's a nonprofit institution. There are no profit and loss statements. They're just budgets. And so there is no way to know how well you're doing. After all, when you think of an entrepreneur, what do entrepreneurs do? They take resources. They might take, say, $1 million worth of land, labor, capital, technology, whatever resources they use, and they recombine those resources into some sort of product or services, and hopefully the consumers will value that combination of resources at more than $1 million. If that's true, then that's a profit. So if they can get these same resources that they paid $1 million for and recombine them in a way and produce some gadget that people are willing to pay $2 million for, they've created value, they've created wealth. And the profit and loss statements will tell them you're doing the right thing, or you're not doing the right thing. In my other lecture, I use my example of my cast iron tennis ball factory. If I use my resources to produce cast iron tennis balls and then no one shows up to buy them, my accountants will tell me, bad idea. But that's how I know. But government doesn't have that. There's no way of knowing how well you're doing. All you know is we're supposed to do this job. We spent $670 billion this year doing it. We screwed up badly. Therefore, we need 30% more money next year. That's how government pretty much works. Okay. The absence of profit and loss statements makes rational economic calculation impossible in government. That's how entrepreneurs calculate whether they're doing the right thing or not. But because you don't have profit and loss statements, there's no way of doing that. Okay, so in other words, it's random. It's mostly guesswork. On top of that, in the government sector, there are perverse incentives. since there are no profits per se in government, government managers cannot take money home. If they save the taxpayers money by cost cutting at the Department of Defense or somewhere, they can't personally take that money home. They dicker around with bonuses and things in the government, but usually everybody gets a bonus. It's usually it's not based on who did what or anything like that. It's just if they can con the Congress into allocating money into a bonus, then everybody gets one, regardless of your performance. So it's not the same at all. But so generally, you can't take home the money you save the taxpayers in form of increased profits because there are no profits, in a legal sense. So what can you do? Well, you can spend money on perks, and one of the main ways in which government managers spend money on so-called perks is more staff, empire building, more people who work for you. Because if you want to rise up in a government bureaucracy and get a bigger, higher profile, better paying job, one of the main criteria is proving that you can manage a larger and larger number of people. And so, and that's the first criteria. And I've worked for governments before. I taught at a state university. I taught at the University of Tennessee. George Mason is a state university. I taught there. But I never worked for the federal government. But one time in around 1987 or 88, somebody in the Reagan administration called me and asked me if I was interested in the job as the director of the textile division of the International Trade Commission in Washington, D.C. And he said, we have 15 people there, and what they do is they do studies of the impact of imports on the U.S. economy, and none of them has even a BA degree in economics. So we're looking for an economist to start doing this. And, but anyway, the main question was, have you ever managed a group of 15 or 20 people? And I said, no, I'm an academic. I can hardly manage myself. I can manage 15 people. And so, but that's usually that's the criteria. Have you managed a bunch of people? And if the answer is no, then it's tough to get any kind of a job unless you're the cousin of a senator or something, the connection. And so what that means is that every bureaucrat is inherently an empire builder who wants to surround himself or herself with as many people as possible to prove that they can manage lots of people. Now, corporate executives do the same thing, but there's always that bottom line. If you hire too many people, it might be nice to have a big staff to go out and run every errand for you, but if it reduces the profits and it reduces the efficiency of your organization because there are too many people running around, too many committee meetings and things, it'll affect the bottom line ultimately. So there is an incentive to watch it with the staffing over time in the corporate world, but no such incentive exists in the government. And so you tend to have a proliferation of employees. And there have been many studies of this, from local government to the federal government. There was a man who used to teach at the City University of New York, I think. He was a garbage economist. What is his name? He studied the garbage collection industry. Savas. I think it's Stephen Savas, S-A-V-A-S. And such things, did surveys of private versus government garbage collection, and the government trucks always had more people riding on them than the private trucks, for example. Why? Because a lot of these jobs are just patronage jobs. They're not necessary to collect the garbage, but they're patronage jobs, and that person's spouse, that person's adult children, that person's brother, sister, will all vote for the politician who gave them the patronage job. And so jobs in the government sector are often looked at as votes, potential votes by politicians, not as something where it's necessary to do the job. Okay, so they're overstaffed. Another thing some of you are familiar with is that at the end of every budget year in the government, if you have any money left over in your budget, say you've accomplished what you're supposed to accomplish and you have $50,000 left over, what do you think happens to that $50,000?
Buy coffee pots.
Yeah, you'll spend it on whatever you can spend it on, because even if you're an angel and you think what you're doing is saving the world, you need more money to save the world. So if you want more money next year from the Appropriations Committee, they're going to ask you, well, you achieved your objective and you had money left over this year. Why do you need money next year? Because there will be some other government agency that would be making the same argument in front of the same Appropriations Committee saying, we need that money to achieve our objective. Don't give them that money. And so there's an incentive to spend every last dollar, whether you want to or not. And I learned this when I was in graduate school. A friend of mine was the director of the library. And on the basement floor of the library, you could hardly make your way through there. It's where they kept the old economics, the back issues of the economics journals in the basement of the library. So I was down there all the time, and you had to like walk around like this because there was so much furniture piled up everywhere. And I asked him about this, and sure enough, it was because for the past several years, at the end of the budget year, he had his eye on a new computer system. He said for the library, and he had something like $300,000 left over in his budget. And so he bought every staff member 2 or 3 desks and 2 or 3 chairs and all this stuff and just piled it up in the basement. And this happens. Every couple of years, the Washington Post runs a big article about how there's enough furniture stored in warehouses around the Washington, D.C. area to furnish maybe several European countries. But because for decade after decade after decade, this goes on every single year by dozens of government agencies. And what are they going to do with all this stuff? And so, in other words, there's an incentive to maximize cost in government. Unlike the private sector, where the rewards are all in the direction of rewarding you for minimized cost, you get rewarded for maximizing cost in the government sector. Another element of the part of the incentive system in this sector is that in government, failure is success. Okay, in the private sector, success is success. But in the government sector, failure is success. If you're the public schools, the worst job you do in educating kids, if they get dumber and dumber every year, you get more money. If you're in charge of a poverty program and poverty gets worse and worse, you get more money. Obviously, that's the answer, more money. You name it, whatever the program is, the worse you do, the more money you get, especially education. I'm just listening to the car radio here today. In Alabama, they're debating raising taxes. And they had some guy on, his real sickening-sounding character. I'm talking about he's concerned about the welfare of his children and grandchildren. If they don't raise taxes in the future, the educational system will go to hell in Alabama. And there's no talk at all about whether or not more money will be put to any good use or not. It's just assumed that more money means better education, even though all the there's several decades of evidence contradicting all that, as far as that goes. Now, another incentive I want to talk about is I want to give you an example, or maybe a hypothetical example, of my plan for restructuring the American grocery industry. And here's my plan. Free groceries for everyone. No, well, I'll put quotation marks under free, because free meaning we'll have a grocery tax of, say, I don't know, $4,000 a family in Auburn, Alabama. Let's just start with that. So there'll be a $4,000 a year grocery tax. But you can buy, when you walk into a grocery store, you just take whatever you want. There's no cashiers or anything like that. You just get what you want, because after all, food is important. It's too important to be left in the hands of greedy profit makers. And so everyone is assigned to a local store. That is, if you lived right here in this neighborhood, I don't know, where's the nearest grocery store? It might be Walmart down the road down there. And so you're assigned to that store. That's where you shop for groceries. You can walk in anytime, take whatever you want. Okay, that's okay. All employees paid the same by seniority. That is, if you have 2 years seniority, you get paid the same as everybody else with 2 years seniority. If you've been there for 10 years, you'll make more, but you'll make the same as everybody else who's been there for 10 years. Okay, so in other words, if you're a checkout clerk and you've been there for 5 years, you make the exact same amount of money as the butcher in the back in the meat counter who's been there for 5 years. Okay, do that. If you have spoiled meat, or no, spoiled vegetables, let's say, spoiled veggies, and rotten meat, because of bad management practices, well, that means higher taxes. People have to eat, after all. You can't split. People in Auburn starve to death. So if you happen, human beings are going to make mistakes. If you have managers who are bad managers and they let the vegetables spoil and the meat is rotten, well, you need more vegetables and meat. And you go buy it. It takes money. Okay. The final thing I'll mention here is, well, you can't see that. Shopping requires double payment. That is, if you wanted to go get in the car and go to Atlanta and buy some groceries, you can, but you'd have to probably get special permission from the grocery czar, and you could pay cash in Atlanta. I was talking to the guys from Latin America. Where are they? Are they in here? Yeah, you guys were telling me that. Was it you? Yeah, it was you. We were talking about how some people from Venezuela and elsewhere fly to Miami to buy groceries. Not your average working stiff, but people who have money to fly to Miami. So going to Atlanta would be nothing. You just get the SUV down the highway an hour and a half, and you load up. But you'd pay double for that. Okay, so those are the basics of my plan to restructure the American grocery industry. And so what would you think would be the efficiency of an industry like this? Yeah. What's that? Not very good?
Well, it would need a regulatory agency to make sure.
Oh yeah, you would have that. Yeah. Well, what American industry is in fact structured exactly like this?
Education.
Right. If you substitute the word education for groceries, it's exactly all these things. You're free public education, but you pay property taxes to pay for it. Everyone's assigned to a local school. All teachers are paid the same by seniority, so that if you have too many phys ed teachers but not enough math teachers, how would a private school solve that problem? Offer math teachers more to get them to come and apply for your jobs, but you can't do that with civil service regulations in the teachers unions. If you get spoiled veggies and rotten meat, well, rotten education, raise taxes. That's always the solution. You can send your kids to private schools, but you have to pay tuition, and you still have to pay your tax. So in other words, it's exactly the same thing. And many government enterprises are monopolies, after all. They're run as monopolies, and they face the same incentive structure, same or similar, maybe not absolutely identical to this, but a similar incentive structure. The government-run monopolies are even worse than a temporary private monopoly because you're coerced to pay for it. There's no way out. You have to pay taxes for it. They have a captured audience of customers. So why should they pay attention to what the consumer wants? They can thumb their nose at the consumer, and the consumer has nothing to do. Can't get out of it very easily. Even at the local level of government, there's a huge literature on voting with your feet, and how in public finance anyway, of how if you don't like what you're getting in Auburn, you can always move to another jurisdiction that has lower taxes or better schools, and that's true to an extent. But then at the same time, there's been a huge move in the United States for the past 100 years or so on the part of the federal government to try to homogenize everything that goes on in the states. Any state, for example, that disobeys some sort of federal edict or regulation is threatened with losing its highway grant money, and they immediately surrender to what the federal government wants to do. So the federal government sort of increasingly cartelizes what the state and local governments do, and the state and local governments are really just more or less franchises of the federal government in America anymore. They're not really independent state and local governments. And so Americans don't have as much ability to vote with their feet as you would think, because there aren't that many options. Where are you going to move to as far as that goes? Did somebody have their hand up back there?
Actually, I was just going to say, where I live in California, the property prices are already high, but to go to a good school district, the same house down the street, which would be $400,000, $800,000. It's just
because of the bill.
Yeah, and you know what? Teachers want to teach there, and the good teachers want to teach there because the parents are like, you're going to school and you're going to learn, and you're not going to, do the wrong things.
Yeah.
And those schools are good schools, and it's just born out in the market.
Yeah. it's capitalized in housing prices. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that's my grocery example. The final thing, I guess I don't need to talk too much about politicians to this crowd, but as far as public sector incentives go, but for politicians, there's how many of you have ever heard of or read anything in the field of public choice, or have heard of it? About half of you or something like that. Okay, well, there's one book I would recommend if you want to read up on this. There's a book by William Mitchell and Randy Simmons, they're the authors. And see, I got a mental block. I can't think of the title. I'll dig it up later. But if you look up William C. Mitchell and Randy Simmons, it's a survey of public choice that can be used in an undergraduate course. I'll think of the title in a minute, but it's a good book if you want to introduce yourself to this literature on public choice. And the basic idea is that politicians are, as human beings, most of them anyway, act in they're rational, self-interested human beings, and so they're no different than anybody else in that they pursue their own self-interest as they foresee it, and that guides their decision-making in their roles as politicians. That's the basic underlying assumption. So the same assumption economists make about human action when we're talking about consumers or business managers, the same assumption is made for politicians. And so what are the implications of that? Well, every politician wants to be reelected and keep his or her job just like anybody else wants to keep their job. And so what can they do to do that? Well, one thing they have to do is support government programs that provide benefits to relatively small, concentrated special interest groups and spread the costs out among the general public. Raise everybody's tax by $2, for example, to give farmers 1,000 farmers $50,000 a year in farm price support payments. That way the small special interest group of the farmers will provide lots of votes and political campaign contributions and return some of that money to the politicians to help them get reelected with. And the average taxpayer doesn't even know that their $2 went to the farmers. So they're not going to oppose it at all. I would bet none of you, maybe one of you, I don't know, none of you probably know that the price of sugar in the United States for years has been about double the world price because of price supports. Okay, some of you shaking your heads. You're lying. You didn't know that. But the average, economics students might know this, but the average working person out there doesn't know this.
Peanuts are even worse.
Peanuts. You name your agricultural product. And so there's a small group of several hundred farmers who benefit tremendously from this, and they pay back the politicians with campaign contributions and other forms of support, but the average citizen doesn't know it. And even if you did know it, what could you do about it? What would you have to do to get rid of the sugar price support program? What would literally have to happen?
Hang the politicians?
No? Well, yeah, that would work. But then, as H.L. Mencken said, you'd get a group in just as bad.
Overcome whatever collective action problem.
Right, you'd have to overcome whatever collective action problem there is. In other words, you'd have to get a majority of Congress to vote to repeal it. And that's a tough order. Who wants to do that? How many citizens are motivated to get involved and spend the time, effort, and money to do that? It's happened before. I mean, there has been deregulation of various sorts, but it's pretty rare. Okay. Another thing politicians are likely to do is, at least at the federal level especially, debt finance. That is, spend money now on your constituents and spread the costs over the future by borrowing money. State and local governments, they issue debt also, but they can't print money to monetize it. But that's why politicians of all parties love debt finance. You can hand out welfare payments today, and people who are not even born yet will be paying it in 20 years from now. A baby born tomorrow starts working. If they start working at age 18 in a part-time job and have federal income tax taken out of their check, will be paying off some of that 30-year debt that was issued today for some program that the government does. If it issues a 30-year bond, for example, or a 20-year bond for that matter, as far as that goes. And another thing that economists talk about in public choice is fiscal illusion. And this is a very shadowy concept. And what this has to do with is that politicians have an incentive to make the cost of government as invisible as possible. And so debt finance is favored. Inflation is a good way, is the best way to finance government because after all, what counts to the voters is the perceived cost. Perceived cost. You know, when you go and buy a loaf of bread, there's no fooling you. The price is right there on the loaf of bread. But with government, when you're supposedly buying government, paying for government, it's not as clear cut as far as taxes go. You know, taxes. There are explicit taxes and there are implicit taxes. Inflation is an implicit tax. Debt is an implicit tax, and all sorts of excise taxes that are buried in the price of goods is an implicit tax, which is a form of fiscal illusion. There's a Financial Times writer named Amity Shlaes. She used to write for the Wall Street Journal. She wrote a book on taxation. What is it, the Dark Hand or something like that? Has anyone seen Amity's book? I actually gave her the idea for the book. She wrote me a nice note thanking me for giving her the idea, but she didn't send me a copy. Somehow idea. But I think that the Dark Hand or something like that. But if you go on Amazon, you'll find it. But it's if you want a good source of just how the extent to which Americans are taxed to death on everything. You know how much. If you want to find out how much tax you pay on a bottle of beer, her book will tell you. For example, and most people don't know that. Like a fifth of whiskey, if you pay $10 for a fifth of whiskey, it differs state by state, but it's not unusual for about $6 to be taxed on a $10 bottle of whiskey. And of course, most people don't know that. They think it's the corporations that are gouging them, charging this much for all these things. And that's another thing the politicians do. They put hidden taxes on all these things, and then they blame the corporations for high prices on the hidden taxes. Gas tax. You know, who knows how much gas tax there is. Whenever I fly into Atlanta and I rent a car to come down here, I usually wait till I get into Georgia to buy gasoline because in some years gas is like 20 cents a gallon cheaper in Georgia than Alabama, and it's because of the state gas tax differential that's out there. And so that's another trick. And I wrote a whole book several years ago called Official Lies, How Washington Misleads Us. And it's all about the giant propaganda machine that Washington is. Every government bureaucrat is a professional spewer of propaganda in support of his or her own government agency. They're all full-time publicists and propagandists for their agency. And so, and I don't want to go into it. I'll give you two examples on welfare. The official government statistics on income distribution. They don't count the welfare payments that go to the poor, so that if you make, say, $10,000 in cash income, low-income person, and you receive $20,000 in government benefits, cash and in-kind benefits, the statistics don't count the $20,000 in government benefits. Your income is not $30,000, it's $10,000. On top of that, they don't subtract taxes from the higher income people. They list your income. And so they overstate the income of the wealthy and understate the income of the poor, and so to exaggerate the extent to which people are in bad condition, the poor, and to make the income distribution look skewed. There's an economist named Edgar Browning I think he's at Texas A&M now. He was he's been at Texas A&M for many years. I've used his public finance textbook for many years, and of course he has a very nice microeconomics text, a mainstream intermediate micro text too. But he's studied this, written some articles in the American Economic Review and elsewhere, and he says, if you look at this, the way the government skews the statistics in this way, just the official poverty level, they tell us that something like 10% of the population is living in poverty as defined by the government, but it's really more like 3% if you if you count all these the benefits that people get. So that's one kind of lie. Another kind of big lie has to do with farmers. And if you ever want to read some entertaining things about farmers, look up H.L. Mencken's essay called "The Husbandman." And if any of you are fans of H.L. Mencken, you'll laugh your head off. I think it's pretty good. You should check out H.L. Mencken if you haven't. Murray Rothbard once told us a story that I think is probably a true story. He wasn't known as a liar, I don't think, but he once told us that he spent his honeymoon night, stayed up all night. Well, that which doesn't sound unusual. Stayed up all night. He and Joey were reading to each other passages from Mencken, from H.L. Mencken, and laughing their heads off all night long until the sun came up. And that's how they spent that's what Murray said, how he spent his honeymoon. It might have been a story, I don't know, but it sounds like the kind of thing he would have done. But I always enjoyed Mencken too. But if you want to read about entertaining things about farmers, but with farmers, most Americans think farm programs support the small family farm, and therefore they support it. They like this image of the small farmer out there toiling, and they don't mind paying a little higher tax to help out this guy at the roadside stand out there who has a little farm and selling tomatoes. But most of the farm programs are based on the size of the farm, so that if the direct payment programs, that is, if you have a 100,000 acre farm, you'll get paid 10 times more than if you have a 10,000 acre farm. And so a lot of the big corporations get a lot of the money. In my book, Official Lies, I quoted a news article about how the Prince of Liechtenstein and his American business partners received, I think, $7 million in farm support payments one year. And not an especially needy person, you would think, the Prince of Liechtenstein. We also cited Sam Donaldson, the news guy, the newsman, received, I think, $3 million for not raising sheep on his New Mexico sheep ranch. And my old friend Walter Williams read this and wrote in one of his syndicated columns that he is demanding the U.S. agriculture also pay him $3 million because he too does not raise sheep. And so he said, you know what? Me too, for that matter. I don't raise sheep. Why don't I get $3 million? So, at least we know what Sam's toupee is made out of. In light of that. So that's another kind of lie that the government tells the small family farmer. They define a farm. If you own any kind of a livestock, like a lot of people own, where I live, there's a quarter mile down the road, there's a little stable of horses where some of my neighbors own horses. And they board the horses, and then on weekends they ride the horse somewhere, and they pay the people to feed the horse and take care of it. But if you own livestock like that horse, my neighbors are officially listed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture as farmers because they own a horse. They don't even have gardens; they just own a horse, and so that enables them to exaggerate the number of farmers. And whenever there's a farm crisis, they can say 2.5 million American farmers are in trouble. Okay, well, that's it for government incentives I wanted to talk. Now, the semi-public sector, I think Lou had in mind having me talk about the nonprofit sector. But some of the things to think about, incentives, in the private sector, in the business sector, we had the stock market, consumer pressure, shareholder pressure, all putting pressure to minimize costs, maximize profits. In the government, those pressures are not entirely absent. I mean, there are elections. If government gets too egregious, we do every once in a while throw the rascals out and put a new set of rascals in that might not be quite as bad. And one example is in antitrust, which I've talked about. I'm going to talk about again. Antitrust has been largely neutered. Not largely, but it's been neutered a lot more than it was 25 years ago. Most mergers are allowed nowadays. 30 years ago, that certainly was not true. So the progress sometimes is made. It's not always no progress. And so we at least have elections, and you can throw the rascals out. But with the nonprofit sector, they don't have shareholders. Okay, after all, so there's no stock market pressure. They don't really have consumers although some nonprofits sell things, like Lou sells books, and so I guess he does have some consumers. Some nonprofits can run businesses, but there's something called the Unrelated Business Income Tax, that they have to pay. Like Boston University runs a bookstore, and they make a lot of profits selling T-shirts and books and things at the bookstore. And I'm mentioning Boston University because somebody sued them. A local bookstore sued them for I don't know, they tried unfair competition because they had an identical store selling T-shirts and CDs and books and things, and the local bookstore said, well, why do we pay tax and them not? And so Boston University was forced to start paying this unrelated business income tax. That is, it's not necessarily related to education. Their bookstore, they sell Snoop Dogg CDs and things like that in there, and so it makes money. So they pay this tax on it, but that's a minimal. It's very minor, minor. So they do have some consumers, but not many. Like the American Cancer Society doesn't have many consumers. They don't sell that much stuff. They die off, I guess, but they don't. I'm saying that they don't sell products to any significant degree. You can have donor influence if you think about it. Especially if you have a big donor, you don't want to make the big donors unhappy, and so they'll put influence on you. But then again, the bigger a nonprofit organization gets, and the more donors, the less influence each individual donor will have. The example of Yale University comes to mind. A few years ago, there was a wealthy family, the Bass family from Texas. They gave Yale a huge amount of money. Does anybody remember the amount? It's like $100 million, I think. Tens of millions of dollars to start up a new program to reintroduce the teaching of Western civilization at Yale. And of course, the faculty were outraged over this. It is a bad idea. And so they didn't do it, and the Bass family was given their money back, all this money. And so sometimes, if they have a $4 billion endowment, even $25, $50 million, then they're not that concerned about it. And so, yes, donors can have an influence, but the more donors there are, the less influence each individual donor will have. There are no elections. The people who run nonprofits are never run for re-election like politicians do. And another aspect of nonprofits is there's something what you might call a halo effect, that they're not in it for the profit, supposedly, although in reality they all are, I would argue. The only reason why they're called nonprofit is it's illegal to distribute the profits to shareholders. But somebody makes the money, and if they have somebody benefits from the spending, usually the staff. You can see the Lew Rockwell's fleet of cars parked out front, for example. Those are all his cars. You probably thought it was people coming here. So you have this halo effect that if they're not in it for the money, they're not pursuing profit, then you shouldn't question their motives or what they're doing. And a good anecdote of this is some of you probably watch this old windbag on the Fox War Channel. His name's Bill O'Reilly. If you watch anybody watch the Fox War Channel, Bill O'Reilly? Well, after the 9/11 bombings, the Americans donated, millions and millions of dollars for the families of the people, the victims of the bombings in New York City, and more money than they knew what to do with. And a lot of it went to the American Red Cross, was promised to give it to the families. And O'Reilly got his staff to find out that months and months and months had passed, and they had given away almost nothing to these families. And what are they doing with the money? And they pretty much were saying, we're going to keep it. We're going to, they said, well, we have other programs. We anticipate future victims of terrorist attacks, so we're just going to hold on to the money for now because there's going to be future victims and pay our own salaries with it. And but all that pressure, I think O'Reilly himself put a lot of pressure on the Red Cross to actually give the money to the people who the American donors thought they were donating the money to. Because they said, give us the money and we'll pass it through to the families. They didn't do that very well. It was minimal. And so, but this halo effect, O'Reilly was very bold in doing that because nobody else was doing it. And he took a lot of heat for doing that. Who would dare to criticize the Red Cross, after all? In fact, and I've experienced that myself. Jim Ben and I, after the United Way of America scandal of a few years ago, I don't know if any of you remember this, where the head of the United Way went to jail. He was collecting all this money, and what it was, he got caught spending it on like he was in his 60s, and he had a 22-year-old girlfriend in Florida, and he bought her a condo, and He made 11 trips in the United Way private jet with his gambling buddies to Las Vegas at the United Way expense, things like that. And it was just an accident that some reporter got wind of this, and he ended up in jail. And so Jim and I started thinking, well, how do some of these other big charities spend their money? And so we got a hold of the audited financial statements of some of the big charities in America. And I don't think you could get them now. They're too wary of people like us digging around in their financial statements. But we had like the American Cancer Society, American Lung Association, the Heart Association, a bunch of others. And then we got their annual reports, which is what, if anybody writes anything about these groups, they write it from the annual report and the press releases that these organizations give out. And they all were bragging that if you give money to them, 85% goes to services of one kind or another. So that only 15% is for administration and fundraising. And most people will think, well, you need some fundraising. It costs money. It costs money to hire a staff, administrators. So that's acceptable. If I give them $1,000 and $850 goes to help my neighbor who has lung cancer or something, that's fine. We looked at their audited financial statements and found out that more like 11% goes to services, to individuals. Well, not 85%. And we published this in the Wall Street Journal, and so they waged like a big campaign against Jim and me to just try to discredit us over this. But it was all based on their own financial statements, and so they had a very hard time in doing it. And the next day, after it appeared in the Journal, the top executives from all these groups were in the office of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal complaining. But I happen to know some of the people there, and they called me up and asked me for questions to ask these guys. So I fed them questions, tough questions to ask these guys. But that's how some of these charities, the big charities, work. It's like that. They have the halo effect, and people who try to ask about it, they try to immediately crack down on. After this, I got all kind of mail from people who had volunteered for some of these groups, like an accountant who volunteered for the American Cancer Society in Atlanta, which is where their headquarters is. And he told me, they don't use accounting methods, normal accounting methods. They use their own personal, stylized accounting methods. They don't use the same as like IBM would use. And he says, an accountant who's volunteering, I tried to get them to use normal accounting methods, and they got rid of me. They said, we don't want your services. And he was some guy with 25 years experience as a CPA. He was volunteering his time, and we don't need you. And so he heard a lot about that. The media give most nonprofits a free pass because, after all, they don't want to be seen as anti-charity. And also the Federal Communications Commission regulation has something to do with this. If you're a radio station, for example, and you have an FCC license, part of that license says that you're performing public services. So that's why if you ever actually walked into a radio station of any size, they usually have down in the front a whole bunch of plaques of public service awards they've gotten for charity events or something like that. But it's not that they're necessarily charitable, but they have to do this to keep the FCC regulators happy. And so if the FCC got complaints from some of these charities that they're being unfairly criticized by WXYZ radio, that could be trouble for that radio station. And so that's another reason why they're not so enthusiastic about that. But anyway, all I wanted to do was to lay out get you to think about some of the incentives that exist, because they're all different in these three sectors. And I don't mean to badmouth charity too much, but I also keep in mind what I said at the beginning, that there are thousands and thousands of nonprofit organizations in America and in many other countries as well. But in America, which I've studied, it's pretty unique in that we've got thousands upon thousands of them that get at least half of their money from the government, because they were started up in the first place to finance the welfare state. And so we have all these organizations with these incentives I've been talking about, and they're funding the welfare state, promoting the welfare state, and it's a pretty insidious thing. And I can recall back when this book came out, Destroying Democracy. we had a meeting with some of the people at the Cato Institute who published the book, and Bill Niskanen, who's now the chairman of Cato, and he's a Chicago School economist. And the Chicago School economists, whenever you write anything, they all want to know about the predictability involved in it. That's their criteria, and can it predict? And at the time, Robert Bork was being nominated for the U.S. Supreme Court, and Bill Niskanen said, if you guys are right about this, that this is such a big problem that the federal government is funding special interest groups to promote mostly left-wing causes, although we did have a chapter called Funding the Right also in there, then he said, then you should predict that Robert Bork will not make it because all these groups will gang up on them. And he was, at the time, was convinced that Bork was going to be a shoo-in because Bork, he was a famous Yale Law School constitutional law professor. He was a federal judge. He was the Solicitor General of the United States, which is the man who argues the United States government's case before the Supreme Court. How more qualified could you get than Robert Bork? And of course, he was dumped. He didn't dump it. So anyway, even by Chicago School's criteria, our book is right on destroying democracy.